this little merch outside for you. It has albums, it has stickers, it has a coloring book with Emma Goldman punching a cop. What's more to love? It's been lovely, thank you. This is a song that we love to play. It's from the Berkowski archives. And it reminds us that we Jews have thought about diaspora and thought about life and liberation and what it means to find that for ourselves and for everyone in very different ways. Heute Zionisten mit einem narischen Mechel, ihr macht gehen zu dem Arbeiter und lernen bei ihm Seichel. Ihr macht gehen zu dem Arbeiter und lernen bei ihm Seichel. Ihr wollt uns Schwank in Jerusalem, wir sollen dort Golodayim. Wir wollen besser sein in Russenland. Wir werden sich befreien. Wir wollen besser sein in Russenland. Wir werden sich befreien. Oh, you foolish little Zionists, with your utopian mentality, you better go down to the factory and learn the workers' reality. You better go down to the factory and learn the workers' reality. You wanna take us to Jerusalem so we can die as a nation. We'd rather stay in the diaspora and fight for our liberation. We'd rather stay in the diaspora and fight for our liberation. Глупенькие зионисты, вы такие утописты. Вы бы лучше шли в рабочие или в трубочисты. Вы бы лучше шли в рабочие или в трубочисты. В Иерусалим, иди за вами не желаем. Мы в России останемся бороться с Николаем. Мы в России останемся бороться с Николаем. We'd rather stay in the diaspora and fight for our liberation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name's Liberty, and I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective. Firestorm is a 13-year-old anarchist cooperative in Southern Appalachia that operates on Cherokee land. As a queer and trans collective, we offer a unique community-supported space that centers books and social media. Starting in March of last year, we moved basically everything we do onto the internet. And we are currently working towards a late spring reopening, but we'll probably continue to do virtual events like this one for the foreseeable future. So I hope that after this event is over, you'll check out our calendar of upcoming events and also our book catalog. We do ship books all over the country if you're calling in from the United States for $1 if the titles are in stock. And we've got a great selection of children's books, sci-fi and fantasy, gardening titles, and lots of other stuff that I think people often don't expect radical bookstores to have. So this is going to be a really awesome event, and I really appreciate you for joining us this evening. I want to go ahead and welcome our panelists who are with us tonight. First up, I want to thank the editor of There Is Nothing So Whole as a Broken Heart, Cindy Milstein. Milstein's a diasporic queer Jewish anarchist who loves shaping and sharing magical spaces with others, being a doula of books and grief, and journeying through the messy, busy beauty of life with as much solidarity, care, and love as possible. We also are joined tonight by contributors to the collection, Abraham and Ben from Fair Collective. Fair is a collective of Jewish revolutionaries, artists, workers, students, and free lovers based out of Atlanta, Georgia, not too far from us here in Asheville. So thanks so much, Abraham and Ben, for being here with us. And then it's also our pleasure to have a couple members of our local community here tonight, Scott and Nahoma. Scott is a queer Jewish anarchist who teaches, writes, translates, organizes, and a whole bunch of other stuff here in Western North Carolina. Nahoma is a religious Jewish lesbian feminist and teacher who shares her love of Yiddishkeit and the liberatory potential of Judaism and Torah wherever she goes. She believes a better world is coming and it will take all of us to make it a reality. So it's a huge honor to be able to host this event tonight with contributors to There's Nothing So Whole as a Broken Heart from AK Press. We know that it's a tough time to sit down together for a conversation in the midst of all the chaos and trauma around us. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge and express solidarity with the protesters in Minnesota and Illinois who are facing militarized police in the wake of the murders of Dante Wright and Adam Toledo. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Milstein, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to start off by really thanking Firestorm and Ash and Liberty in particular. They put absurd amounts of care into this event. And I can visualize being with them in the Firestorm space. So I'm trying to pretend to do that right now, to conjure that space, because this space is so hard and painful to be in a way, to be so far from each other. But I'm really grateful for the care put into this. And I want to thank everyone who's here and present this evening, including our ancestors, because I feel like they're here with us, and they should be. And we can speak to them too, and hopefully heal them as well as ourselves. So I want to open this space, which again feels really bittersweet and poignant to me, because I do projects like this to create containers and provocations and inspirations for us to have dialogues together in person, have wrestle together with all the things that come out of them, the stories. And so, how do we do that here? So I want to try to bring in some of what the anthology talks about a lot, which is the power of Jewish rituals to shatter hegemonic, hierarchical, deadly time, with a capitalized time, by self-determining our own time and spaces, spaces that are outside and beyond, that point toward the promise of what we know is possible in spaces. A very anarchistic practice, but within Judaism, it's just absurdly rich. If you actually practice Judaism, the more you practice it, the more you start doing holidays and rituals, the more you could basically step out of the time of patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, and come into our own time most of your days, which is beautiful. So I want to start off with that, with two concepts. One is something called Mishkan, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, which I just learned about during Passover, Passover, when Jews a couple thousands of years ago fought their way out of enslavement, and through forms of resistance and escalation and direct action, and freed themselves, and they liberated themselves, but they didn't free themselves. And when they went into liberation, as the story goes, they wandered for 40 days. That is the time when they transitioned from the sorrow and the grief and the pain and the struggles to try to begin to understand what freedom would look like. And they created these structures called Mishkan, that word means places to dwell in, or to rest in, or to live in. And they were these communal spaces that were temporary, that they would have to put together and take down as they moved, because they couldn't stay in the same place because they were fleeing. And in those places, they were sacred places of connection and just telling stories and healing and understanding what liberation is. So I hope tonight we can create this temporary space and hold it for an hour and a half, and then fold it up and bring it with us and create other spaces and other places, because that's what we do as queers and Jews and anarchists, time and time again. But there's beauty in saying we can do that in our own way, not. And the second thing is, in this really hard year of loss and pandemic and plagues and murderous cops and all the other things we could name that have stolen so much from us, again, re-traumatized us, brought up new traumas. I want to use a Jewish ritual called Kaddish, which is a morning prayer. And there is not just one morning prayer. In Judaism, there's thousands of versions of this, because people rewrite it for the time and the context. Again, Judaism has its rich tradition across the globe, across cultures, languages, places, traditions. And so Kaddish looks different at different moments. Tonight, it's always, though, a communal space of naming and holding our losses together. And in the spirit of that, we often say things like, may the memory of our losses spark a blessed revolution. And that's why we do Kaddish. So I want to turn it over in a minute to Ben from Thayer to say a version of Kaddish. And during that time, for those of you present, in whatever way feels good to you, name your losses, speak them, write them, think them, hold them. Yeah, as a way to love and honor and feel, the memory of what we're holding coming into this space. So Ben.
Creator of the world, God of the spirit of all flesh, is revealed and known before you. That is my fervent desire to praise your name and to remember and honor our beloved, all those that we have lost to police violence, the martyrs who have died fighting against it, and those in our personal lives we have lost along the way as well. May you grant hope and healing to all who suffer, and may we soon be able to once again safely gather in holiness and joy. May your name, Adonai, be elevated and sanctified everywhere on earth, and may joy reign everywhere.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak for a few more minutes before we kind of pass it along and open it up for more dialogue. Yeah, I wanted to open this with thinking about our experiences of loss and pain and trauma, and as the title of the book, which is not my formation, it comes from a rabbi, I think from 2 or 3 centuries ago. I should have written that down. But this idea of there's the paradox of like, how can something be whole? How can our hearts be whole when they're so broken? And I think, I want to bring that in, that I think a lot of us understand that intellectually as anarchists and Jews and queers of how we do that. But I really want to hold that. This book came out of that desire of mine, of mine in a way, as a Jewish queer anarchist, to be able to speak our own experiences of that loss and trauma and historical and present day, and in a way that was, speaking from our own shared experiences and being able to do that. But at the same time, I want to say that the whole, right? There's a whole heart too that's coming to that. So I'm trying to speak from my whole broken heart tonight. And that within our tradition, we're able to find that loss also, life isn't just about loss, right? It's about joy and resilience and struggle and all the other beautiful things that come into this. So how I understood this book was that one way to come at that is to tell stories to each other. I think this is a very Jewish thing. The book project, in a way, is I realized after doing it, like how Jewish I am in certain ways, is when the more you become interested in Judaism as a practice, or you're around other people who understand bringing their Jewishness into practice, whether it's the written Torah or how we understand learning or other documents, there's no stable word that is good for all times. There's the idea that we, all the Jewish writings basically are a whole bunch of stories that are then told in writing and in oral traditions. And the whole point of it is they're living, they're breathing, they're dynamic, that we constantly wrestle with new things that come into those stories and new contexts. And the stories become richer and fuller and more whole by bringing all the different pieces together. So it's no accident that a lot of Jews have tended to be radicals, because part of that idea of wrestling with the real complexity of this world is in a way that doesn't look at the binaries of this world, that looks at how really difficult and complex and nuanced and full of tensions and questions that we have no answers for, but we have lots of ways to wrestle with and debate them and rethink them and try to practice them. Is exactly sort of the practice, of Judaism. And we do that as a way to create a social fabric, a community outside states. Now, this is one interpretation, but I take this very seriously as someone who understands myself as as in the diaspora still, is for most of our history, we have been, our calendar is actually 5,781 years old. And during a lot of that time, we have been outside of states, outside of, hegemonic structures, and people have had to just understand what it means to be in community, to self-organize a community around language and culture and food and song and ritual and resistance and struggles. And I think that's a real gift. So it also points to why so many anarchists kind of emerge from this tradition. And a lot of the stories that we tell in this anthology too are stories that are trying intentionally to shake up our thought and our world and our bodies and our emotions in order to turn this world upside down to try to create a better one, right? To try to continually move toward that without there sort of being an end point, right? This is this process of continually trying to understand with our broken hearts how we can make them more whole, but that's like an ongoing process, right? So that's one way I've understood this book. So I really, I hope you'll pick it up. I hope you'll read it. There's like, I think 40 or so different stories, that disagree with each other, that have different styles, that have different experiences. And they're just some stories, right? It's an invitation to tell all our stories. And a lot of stories aren't in there, right? It's just like if we go into Judaism, we'll find our stories aren't there, or we will uncover by reading other stories that we'd forgotten and that have been stolen from us and lost. So what I hope this anthology is doing is, for me, I really feel, I don't know how to describe this in words that fail me. This anthology is trying to celebrate the joy of being a queer and a Jew and an anarchist. And I feel really proud of those identities and understand those identities all bring their own traditions of saying, fuck assimilation and normativity and trying to fit into states or colonialism or binary structures, that we are intentionally non-hierarchical, egalitarian, seeking solidarity and mutual aid, right? Chosen families and friendships and relationships, right? And I understand within all these things blending together, that it's by us sharing our experiences that we realize how much has been stolen from us, Jews and non-Jews alike, by colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy. We uncover what's already there. So I only going to talk for another 5 minutes, so I could give so many examples that have been really powerful to me. And I'll step back a minute. The reason this anthology emerged was because pre-pandemic, I'm generally a diasporic person. I don't feel comfortable in one. I feel better in motion, in a sense, with making community where I am. And I really do. I understand that as that practice I started out at the beginning of Mishkan. You sit down and you create a sacred space with who you're with, and you create really deep, rich connections. And when you can't be there any longer, you do that somewhere else, but you try to keep the connection somehow. There's a continuity too. So I do that out of the pain and out of protection because of ancestral trauma. And I do that out of the beauty of us not getting stuck by borders or states or all these artificial boundaries, right? So there's a real power. Diaspora is a word that is both about being torn apart and scattered against our will, but it's also this beautiful word that means us seeding things all over the place, right? Seeding possibility, seeding freedom, seeding dignity and self-determination, freedom, right? So as part of that, the reason this book emerged was I was traveling around, I kept seeing this resurgent, really wonderful, queer, feminist, Jewish anarchism that was just coming into its own and uncovering together all these things that are already sort of there that have been stolen from us, whether that's multiple languages. In Judaism, there are dozens and dozens of languages that have been stolen from us. And it's so poignant to have to remember. My ancestors spoke at least probably a dozen languages or more, because I don't even know I only know my history back to my great grandparents, even the loss of our histories, right? So rediscovering foods and traditions. But then we also realize we were there the whole time for a certain degree. And those realizations help us better illuminate how Christian, white, patriarchal supremacy has stolen from all of us. Not, whether we're Jewish or non-Jewish, all the things we're mourning right now for who's getting murdered by police, and Black people are faced more murder by police, or Indigenous people in the last year have faced more by far, as have Black people. The effects of pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. It reminds us that when we see what's been stolen from all of us, we're like, we all have our own experiences and traditions that we can return to that have helped keep us together as peoples outside of those structures that allow us to find a sense of shared solidarity to move forward. So I could name lots of them, and I won't. We can maybe bring that up in the discussion. But those stories help us shatter this mythology, right? And when we shatter the mythology of the stereotypes that have capitalism and colonialism created to push us apart, we realize that anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness and Islamophobia and transphobia, all those stories that are created by the far right or those in power or Christian evangelicals or all the people that have dominant power, we realize that our stories are actually far more intertwined than they are disconnected. Our forms of keeping together through song or through herbs that we use to heal or stories we told, right? We also realize that in Judaism, we find that queers were always there. They were there in the stories. They were there in the pronouns. They were there in the practices. So it's only recently that all these things have been stolen from us. And I'm going to just try to, it's too much to say, so I'm going to try to wrap up. And yeah, I was thinking about, I think it isn't just that it helps us connect to each other in solidarity. I think this past year, when many of us have been so removed from each other, we've been almost compelled to be reconnected to traditions, but also the earth. And so one thing I do want to name, I mentioned the calendar. It's a small thing, right? But this year, for us, for instance, the calendar that's imposed upon us that says we're meeting today on April 15th is a calendar that was created by empires and empires and church hierarchies and all sorts of other structures that kill us, that wanted to contain and control and determine the world and cut us off from the earth. If you go back to the Jewish calendar or calendars that emerge out of non-Western traditions or indigenous calendars, Muslim calendars, almost all of them share in common that they relate to cycles of the moon or the stars or the sun or the earth. So when we start, it isn't just going back to calendars, isn't a small thing. It reminds us that time is a totally different time, right? We can start constructing our own time around the cycle of the earth and being in harmony with the earth and understanding our role in relation to the earth. And right, it shatters a whole sense of control. So I hope that this anthology and the stories we tell is not just for us as Jews and queers and anarchists, and not just for people who are not also Jews, queers, and anarchists, but are also seeking liberation, also seeking a world that is not about us having to be worried about our safety and our lives and death, or all the things that we faced over the centuries, but is about us heading toward life, that also includes the world around us, the ecosystem that is so far much bigger than us, right? So I'll just end on this note. One thing that also brought the anthology together, that's really prominent in the anthology, was the stories started emerging about 2 years ago. And so there's a lot of emphasis on Charlottesville and the Tree of Life and other moments when the resurgent fascism was targeting many of us, again, not just Jews. But that concept of Tree of Life, it was the name of the synagogue where a white supremacist walked in Pittsburgh and murdered 11 people. The Tree of Life is exactly what we are striving for by telling our stories, by reclaiming these traditions, by being really out there as who we are, right? In this case, queer, Jewish anarchists, reclaiming that we're part of this Tree of Life, our ancestors, us, and what's to come in the future, right? We're trying to grow something different out of this world to mend the world. Right? And I hope we can move into, there's so many ways I have barely touched upon about why there's so much in anarchism that is improves Judaism, to my mind, and so much in Judaism that improves anarchism. And when you put them together, they become so much more whole and complex and beautiful. And then you queer that and it's even more complex and beautiful. So hopefully we can get into some of that in the conversation, because that's, to me, what's so beautiful and powerful about this. And I will turn it over to the Fair Collective.
Hey, we're from the Fair Collective, based here in Atlanta, Georgia. We also were very lucky to contribute to this book in what has become, probably will be, the book of contemporary Jewish anarchism, which fills our hearts. And when Milstein asked us to be on this event, the question is, what are we talking about? And they said, Southern Jewish anarchy and queerness. Okay, we can talk about that. We know a lot about that.
I think probably a good jumping off point is this has obviously been a big year, I think, for like many projects. It like required a lot of shifting around and like maybe repositioning of plans that had occurred just before COVID hit. And that's definitely the case for us. And when the history, like our essay in this is like mainly a history. When the history was written here, it was sort of at like a fulcrum point in our trajectory. And like just after the events of this book, we like very quickly started hosting Shabbat dinners, and that brought in a much wider community to like participate with than I think anyone had anticipated. And specifically what it did was it brought in the, for anyone unfamiliar with Atlanta's synagogue infrastructure, there's a synagogue, like a specifically queer synagogue that arose in the 80s, like out of accommodating Jews who were marginalized during the AIDS crisis. And it's called Bet Havarim. And they have like over the last like multiple decades been like an institution of queer Judaism in Atlanta. And recently though, the like younger generation has, and I'm not a member of the synagogue, so without being able to really speak to any detail of like the specific situation going on, has like found themselves wanting to return to the early days of that synagogue, which were like in people's living rooms and were in, they weren't quite like the board run synagogues that we're used to today. And that coincided with us hosting these Shabbats. So we ended up with like a lot of these young like queer and trans Jews who were searching for specifically a spiritual Judaism, coming into this space that was not essentially spiritual at that time, and not necessarily spiritual. I mean, like, and it was also like, yeah, really ambiguous, which allowed for a lot of great experimentation. And ultimately, I think for like all the members of FAIR, like reinvigorated a sense of pursuing that more spiritual and religious side of Jewish anarchism. And this obviously seems like it's parallel with like a lot of similar journeys that people have gone through over the last like 5 years, which I think differs heavily from Jewish anarchism over the last 100 years, which has like been very anti-religious in nature, depending on like the context, obviously. And yeah, so we hosted the Shabbats, and then like we actually like ramped up really quickly, and it seemed like we were going to be like, we had like a Yiddish study group, like a Ladino study group, that were like pretty autonomous on their own, and then COVID hit and everything sort of like went into disarray, and we like repositioned. I don't really even, do you want to like pick up the history from that point?
We repositioned in that, you know, we were put into smaller cells there, you know, because there's just the tendency to congregate is so ingrained in us. So, you know, the group that was, you know, 50 people was 10 groups of 5 people or something like that in different areas. So those of us who are more oriented around this project were kind of just together. And it did create a shift in like what we wanted to do, because when this project was founded, whenever, I guess some time ago, there wasn't a plan or a destiny. You know, we kind of talk about the reasoning in the book. It was just, we were trying to fight Nazis and we were struggling to get the Jews. And it was like, why can't we get the Jews to fight Nazis? Well, we're the Jews, you know, so we'll just put our own name on it, which we didn't have. And it was really just a front group effectively, but it very quickly became real. And so we were together, we had this thing, and
like yeah, well, no, there are like a lot of side projects now have like, or like I wouldn't even call them side projects, like a lot of like the periphery to, I think, like autonomous Jewish organizing that happened around that Shabbat, like spawned off a set of people who were now like weren't waiting for synagogues to go and do things the way that, like, you know, even after like the events of this book, we've like been in instances where in which like even the most left or progressive synagogue is unable to sign their name onto an action because they either, you know, like JVP is signed onto it, or like are we frozen? No. Either JVP is signed onto it, or whatever the reason is. And so I think that like with like, yeah, we basically like are now sort of surrounded by an ecosystem of similar projects that like have a lot of overlapping membership. And I think now we're sort of like locked in on the one thing that COVID and quarantine did was it allowed everyone space to like sit back and be like, okay, this huge emergent thing just came out of nowhere. Like we all had a lot of energy for a long time, and it was just like, it was like a river, you know, like just going everywhere, sort of like unguided, like not totally guided. And now we were able to sort of be like, what can we do to add some like, you know, guiding planes into this and figure out like where we want to go with this energy that's clearly like dispersing throughout, not just like Atlanta, but the South, and also I think like across the world with regard to like Jewish queer anarchism. And now we're sort of like looking at like, you know, spatial elements. Like, do we like have a space? Do we have like essentially a synagogue or like a sort of like chevra, like study group space? Like, do we like construct these types of things that can accommodate, or at least like construct a model for more intimate synagogue type things to exist that don't fall victim to this sort of board and membership model? And then also, yeah, like because that was a huge reinvigoration of our own religiosity, I think we've also undergone like a lot of really personal redevelopments in like what our religion means to us and like what it means to even like I think it's interesting, the question and like the dynamic that like is said a lot of sort of like what anarchism gives to Judaism and then what Judaism gives to anarchism. And I think that like relational question is like really interesting in the sense that I think when like something I've struggled with as I come up against the religiosity or like the imminence of spiritual like Judaism and traditional like maybe even halakhic Judaism, like we sort of question like, is there really a difference between them? Like, is there really like not necessarily that like Judaism is anarchism, but that like are there not many aspects of just like obvious solidarity that arise when you are authentically following Torah? And whatever, the word authentic here is a very loaded, so, you know, throw that away or whatever. But it's like when you are pursuing Torah to an authentic way to yourself, like, are you not finding yourself at constant anti-state sentiments or constant sentiments that like align you with an abolitionist cause? And I've even heard this, you know, like I've like listened in on some of the Clubhouse like Orthodox Judaism talks on politics or whatever that have been happening recently, and like there are sentiments even within like the very deep Orthodox community that I think are similar to that and are coming to similar revelations outside of like anarchist milieus, and that I think is like going to be an interesting intersection going into the future as sort of queer anarchism becomes more religious in some segments and as religious Judaism opens up to not being so liberal. I think like we'll find some really interesting intersections there.
One of the things that's like very beautiful about like what is being created right now in our little bubble is I like pushed for a long time this notion that we here specifically and probably in other places don't just live in one diaspora but multiple diasporas. You know, to live in, you know, outside of Palestine is the diaspora, but then, you know, there are lots of people who live in these Jewish strongholds, you know, like New York City or Los Angeles, I don't know, you know, where they have Jewish life. But for some of us who grew up in places like the rural South or like the desert West or these places, you know, now you have the second layer of diaspora. It's like, all right, maybe there is a community of about 100 Jews here, but now you bring us into the picture and we're like crazy people who are trying to destroy the nation. And so you go to your synagogue and you say, help me destroy the nation. And they say, no.
They say, who are you?
Who are you? Go away. And now you're put in this farther isolation, this third diaspora that feels so isolating and alone. And to be able to seek out and find each other and establish hubs of revolutionary Judaism, you know, fighting for joy is something that I didn't, you know, I grew up very close, like, you know, my high school was across the street from a farm. So this wasn't something that I ever envisioned as a child. And it's really incredible to see these things come up, especially when I think about where we came from in regards to, you know, creating this brand, which was just like, you know, we're so different. You know, I look back at what we wrote and it is a reality, but it's so not a reflection of what is happening in this moment where, you know, we create this thing as like, all right, what do we brand it as? You know, we want to be like open. We don't, you know, do we call it an anarchist thing? Do we call it a communist thing? Well, Antifa is really, and we'll call it an Antifa thing. And that brand really stuck, and we are facing some consequences from that. But now we're, you know, we're not really this thing like that. We're
artist collective.
We're like, I don't know, we like drink a lot and sing and dance, and we're more like a synagogue than some cell. I don't know. It's just
I do think that the type of, like, I think it's funny because the strains that exist in the essay, like, they didn't go away. Like, there are still the coalitions of Jews that existed for the purpose of what FAIR was at that time. And now it's just that, like, you could find that overlapping group of people in like one of many projects, or like many projects that are just like surrounding us. And I also think, like, damn, I forgot exactly what I was going to say, but yeah, you could find that same strain, just like doing what we were doing here and having the same obstacles that we were having here still existent today. I mean, it's like, I think when, you know, when I first came to Atlanta, it was very, there was no, like, FAIR was like, had maybe been to, it was probably like in the middle of,
Friends, we lost your audio, perhaps? You just cut out.
yeah.
Oh, I think you're back now.
No. What was the last thing that was heard? No.
When you first came to Atlanta.
Okay. Anyway, back then there wasn't like the ability to organize as a Jewish bloc. Now there's the ability to organize as a Jewish bloc, or at least to like reach out to a group of people who are probably not, like, we know for a fact are not all anarchists, but who are like aligned in some sort of, I hate using like the term leftist, but it's like in some sort of like coalition that aligns like in what we might call like a leftist coalition. And it's like, to be able to reach out to those people and say, like, are you going to the demo tonight? Like, what are you guys gonna, like, that ability is like something that has arisen out of the last year.
And equally, like, as important, the ability to like live a true Jewish revolutionary life.
Yeah.
Which
I remember what I was gonna say, actually. Okay, so
Oh no, it happened again just now. Unfortunately, we don't have you back yet. Maybe now would be a good time. Oh.
Are we back?
You are back. Okay, cool. I was about to take us to intermission, but you saved everyone from intermission.
We'll wrap it up.
Yeah, we'll wrap it. Yeah, the like, I think it's good to note that, like, revolutionary anarchism, I think, or revolutionary Judaism, as it's like becoming what it is I think in many ways an expression of like what has always been traditional Judaism, sans the complacency that like a lot of Masorah have of being like, although we want to fully express Torah, we actually can't because of these obstacles from the state, and out of our safety, we therefore must not, like, we must make these capitulations. And I think that like that obstacle of like fear about like disturbing the status quo, which is honestly justified from a historical perspective, like is really the dividing line between more traditional Judaism and maybe like what we might be calling radical Judaism right now. And I think it's less about like alignment with any specifically secular or modern movements, and more about that, at least as far as the anti-state division is concerned. So, like that.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing more information about what's going on in your community. That's really incredible. So something that hasn't really been mentioned yet that we could say about this book, Milstein mentioned that there's about 40 different pieces in here, but didn't actually mention that the range of formats is really broad. So it's poetry, it's essays, it's stories, and there's also quite a bit of really incredible radical Jewish art kind of collected in the center of the book. And so for the next few minutes, we've prepared for y'all a little like kind of slideshow of some of the work that's represented in the book. So this is a good moment to run and pee or stretch, but we hope that if you're able to, you'll also kind of check out this great art that we're gonna share now with you, along with another song. So this will be 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and continue the conversation.
I played a lot of places and I'll play them all again. And everywhere I go I hear the same old thing again. Somebody dies in police custody. Soon there are questions from the family. At first the situation makes the lawmen look so filthy, but they investigate themselves and it turns out that they're not guilty. Hey, hey, taloi police, it means the same thing now as yesterday. Out of your houses into the streets, everybody say, fuck the police. Let's go! Ian Bush's family didn't know he was a killer when Constable Kessler picked him up for an open can of Miller. The video at the station house had somehow got erased, but the bull was there so we could know exactly what took place. The boy jumped on his back, but the cop was quick instead. He reached around and shot him right in the back of the head. Constable Kessler would not demonstrate just how this thing was done. If you think that it's impossible, then the coroner's not alone. Well, hey, hey, taloi police, it means the same thing now as yesterday. Out of your houses into the streets, everybody say, fuck the police. Dee Dee! There must be something magic down in the holding cells, 'cause there's stuff that happens there that just don't happen nowhere else. Healthy people dying from a sudden heart attack. Men who hang themselves with their hands tied behind their back. There's lots of good and brave police, it must be true I guess. It's brave to work with a murderer sipping coffee by your desk. Well, hey, hey, taloi police, it means the same thing now as yesterday. Hey, hey, taloi police, it means the same thing now as yesterday. Out of your houses into the streets, everybody say, fuck the police.
All right, welcome back. So at this point, we're going to open the conversation up a little bit and bring in Scott and Nahoma. So welcome, y'all. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Should I start? Nahoma, do you want to say something first? Me? Well, okay, so like listening to you all and reading this book was really helpful to me. I have struggled for a long time to find ways to integrate the different parts of myself, the Jewishness, the queerness, the anarchism, and there's like, I was raised Jewish and like going to Hebrew school and going to temple every week. And but there was an aspect of that that was authoritarian to me, you know, and I had to rebel against it. And I never found Jews who did it the way I would want to do it, except for, you know, my family, where the rituals that I like grew up, extended family. And reading the people talking in this book about sort of like, I don't know, just like things that I didn't even like, I've never heard other people say about their experiences of Judaism, of anarchism, and how they intersect. It took me a long time. I tried to go with like liberal Jews at some point and see if that fit for me, and that never felt good either. And only recently, and I guess this is like something that's happening in, you know, everywhere now, I've been able to find a group of like-minded people who want to do Judaism in a way that makes sense to me. So it's not this like secret thing that I can't describe to everyone. But like you have to either know it or don't know it, you know, what Jewishness is in a way. So this has been just, this book was really helpful to me to kind of understand what I want basically out of my Jewishness. So I just wanted to say that, and like I'm really grateful for everyone who contributed that in there, and then the ways that all of you spoke tonight about your commitment to it. I have like thoughts and questions that I could like kind of put out there. So we already talked sort of this in the wake of the Tree of Life massacre, and one of the things that Milstein, that you write in the book that is like, I think powerful, is sort of like the everyday anti-Semitism that that people who are Jewish experience. And I think most people who aren't Jews wouldn't even understand or know that. They might even think that that kind of thing is like in the past, you know, after the Holocaust. And it's like, and you note it even in anarchist circles, right, where like people should supposedly know better than to like have anti-Jewish conspiracies. And so like we have this like huge massacre that is like striking, and still probably people forget about that. You know, there's so many horrible events happening all the time, but this like just like minute anti-Semitism, and actually also for like Fair Collective, thinking about like I'm living in the South, and as a Jew I constantly feel, as a queer anarchist Jew, I feel so visible all the time. In my like rural area where I live now, like I'm like, oh my God, someone's gonna beat me up just for like being here. So I don't know, that's like one thing that was like powerful to me to hear people share about, because it's something that like also I don't talk about that often, you know, like anti-Semitism is just like, it's just like sort of always there. That's not a direct question, but I don't know if people have thoughts on that, because that's something that was helpful for me to also just hear other people's experiences of.
Yeah, I would jump in and say that I connected with you, Scott, because when I turned up in Asheville, I've just for a very long time had the attitude of I'm just going to show up and like be like myself. And if nobody likes me, well, and everybody learned something from that. So I showed up and I was like, well, I'm just going to be really Jewish at all the anarchist things. And I'm just going to go to the synagogue because I want the minyan. And if everybody there hates me, I don't ever have to talk to them and I get to eat lunch for free. And that really, I ended up meeting so many people like in all the time since I've been here who have approached me at things and been like, are you Jewish? I'm Jewish. I don't know anyone else Jewish here. And I just go for things. And I reached out to 1 or 2 people I knew and was like, invite everybody you know. We're going to have Rosh Hashanah dinner. And that was probably like 4 or 5 years ago. And in that time, lo and behold, there were like over 100 Jewish people just plugged into things in a pretty small town where we live that like have come over to my house at some point, or I haven't, but are now like I've met them at things at other people's houses. And I know that Fayer, you were talking about how what you wrote about in the book, which had to do with reaching out to synagogues to try to get them to sign on to a protest of neo-Nazis, and none of them would. And you said that's really, your group has really evolved and changed in that time. But I had the experience also of being in the synagogue in a small town and being really committed, that so many people there in like a typical liberals type synagogue with like a huge weekend fundraiser that celebrates Israel Day and stuff, that all of them were so happy to have like religious young people that they were willing to like sit down and listen, like actually listen to the things that we had to say about the state of Israel and Zionism and the history of like entering into that conversation with older people I was connecting with who really love Yiddish language, and talking to them about how the Israeli state ran like a campaign to like burn Yiddish books and like kill the Yiddish language, and like using that as a door to talk to them. And I actually ended up having success with some people that I know who are all primarily connected like to the institutional community through being religious in some way, to hosting like a major leftist event on the yard site of the Tree of Life shooting. And I just found that I don't meet a lot of people who've had that experience of having a really a good amount of success with talking to shuls about like anti-Zionism and police violence. And just thought I'd throw it out there and see what anyone has to say. Thanks.
I really appreciate, I feel like I'm not good on this format and I barely talked about what's in the book in a way. I really appreciate you all like highlighting that power of like a lot of us feeling really invisible, and we can't be Jews in anarchist spaces and we couldn't be anarchists in Jewish spaces. And that when you actually were visible in both those spaces and make our own spaces that are Jewish anarchists, that all those spaces end up opening up space for other people to be anti-fascist, to critique states, to understand you can have spirituality without organized religion and hierarchy. And I mean, I would never have even called myself spiritual, much less anything. I still don't believe in God particularly, although in Judaism, there's never a question you should believe in God or have to believe in God, and there's multiple meanings of what God is, and it changes over context. And I'm told, because I don't read, unfortunately, languages have been stolen from me, and I don't read the original languages, that there isn't any imperative to believe in. It's more to wrestle with whether, wrestle with or trust in or have a sense of it. But I really like this when you add spirituality. It brings in this element where we're able to think about the whole of life and the importance of, everything from, like in the book, there's stories about holidays where there are, celebratory holidays using plays, Purim. And, but that as Jews, as Jewish anarchists, we use those holidays to have queer joy and make them also rebellious and end up drawing out the revolutionary potentials of them. So when you bring spirituality practices and our own sense of the world together. I mean, there's a story again about in the book about doing theater or drag, about writing pieces. A song that played at the intermission is a song that was written over 100 years ago, maybe more. There's a long tradition of anti-police songs within Judaism that goes back for centuries because we've hated the police for a long time, right? So I don't know. I really appreciate all of you speaking about the power of coming out of being invisible and being visible. And when we do that, we become better at fighting fascism because we have a centuries-long playbook of how to deal with fascistic forces. We've gotten pretty good at that. The Holocaust was only the latest. Tree of Life was only the latest. The Capitol assault, all the anti-Semitic tropes in the Capitol assault at the beginning of January was horrendous, right? It's not like anti-Semitism is a minor thing. Every day it wears on me in this culture. And people don't see it, from people saying, oh, Jews take up too much space, which is as if we have some kind of power, which just underlies this trope, I think, of to much worse forms. But when we actually look through those lenses and say, hey, there's anti-Semitism, can't you see? I'm really adamant about that. Can't you see it? Can't you see it? It is dangerous. It's dangerous because anti-Semitism is completely interwoven with anti-Blackness, is completely interwoven with indigeneity. And those things have all been there when you go back in the history of the so-called United States. And there's a US type of fascism that has been there for over 200 years that always has been against, queers, Jews, Blacks, indigenous people, etc. And you can see the histories of that, including prominent personalities who had a lot of power, and so it isn't, they aren't light things, right? And they aren't just so we Jews can say, look at us, we're suffering. Someone might come into where we're, recreating our own Jewish. I mean, that's what's poignant to me. I really want to be visible as a Jew now more and more, right? Because I should be able to be visible. I should be able to be proud and carry banners and that say I'm a Jewish anarchist and wear things that do that. And then the minute you do that, you're, that you're also more of a target, right? But there's something in like a defiance of white supremacy by saying, fuck you, I am a target and I oppose you, right? But we need the solidarity of other people who are doing that too. From other, there are also Black Jews and Asian Jews, and Jews are not, Jews are very diverse. So many of us have multiple parts of us that get targeted by fascism. So the power in it is not just for us as Jews. The power is if we really want to transform the world so we can all heal and enjoy drag and joy and music and dance and spirituality, and the spirit, I'll wrap up on this, the spirituality you all touched on in Judaism that's been really powerful. In the book, there's so many pieces about this, about the spirituality is almost inseparable from a politics. And I don't even understand if you're Jewish, how you can't see that. In Judaism, it feels like the more you study Jewish texts, the more you're like, but how can you not see that it's all anarchism? It's all queer. But the ritual itself creates a kind of healing that I think a lot of us who are queers have had to do with our chosen families, because we can't do that in heteronormative society, right? And so that spirituality is part of those practices, as opposed to like praying to some person who's stapled to a cross, and a church hierarchy or whatever it is. It's like, it's about our intimate social relationships with each other and creating bonds of community and love and trust. And that's what spirituality does to me, and connectedness, right? So I really appreciate you all bringing in a lot of, I'm just kind of rambling, so cut me off.
I do think that the question of visibility is really interesting. And Scott, I appreciate, I think everything that was just said by everyone, really highlights this sort of dissonance between wanting to be visible and fearing being visible, and also fearing being invisible in internal spaces, and also in some ways wanting to be able to be invisible in internal spaces. And I think that that's something that I the way of, and I think this is actually something that in all denominations of Judaism, I think people face the question of how am I going to express myself, not just as a Jew, but as the type of Jew I am. I mean, you have Hasidic garb that differs on a very granular level, depending on how well you can sort of point that thing out. And I think that so I guess outside of just saying that I resonate with that really highly, I think that on top of being fearful of, especially in the South, of personal attacks on if you're outwardly expressing as queer and or Jewish, I think also there's this aspect of in places where Jews are not so heavily present, that there is a mythology of Jews, not just for white supremacists, but also for for almost every community, of what a Jew is. And I think then outwardly expressing as a Jew in a way that is in a mutual aid group, or just as a community or as a neighbor or something, it does this sort of compounding thing of being able to like, and it's been really weird. I think like I've experienced this many times of like, just like being very like having full on like seat and shit like that, and like walking out onto the street and like talking to my neighbors who have like probably never met a Jew before, and they will just like do like a double take, but they like always are like very like involved. They like don't like once it's past that level, it's like just like a question and answer sort of like really nice like mutual exchange of like understanding of like what it means to have him like to be nailing a mezuzah to my like door frame and all these kinds of things. And I think it does a lot to like construct a level of representation on like a, not like on a large abstract political level, but on like a very personal level that is like sorely missing and is often only really there like, I think if your like landlord is Jewish in New York, you know, like it's like these things that like ultimately like are happening and are really only happening in a negative way, or like you're like lobbying for AIPAC or something like that, right? Like, and it's like, I think these sort of micro expressions of our Judaism or our queerness or both like serve as like this sort of like conglomerate front against this already existing sort of like negative stereotype that is constantly being expressed by insular communities that like otherwise don't want to express as aspects of the community with people outside of the Jewish community.
There was a question I just saw in the chat that was also something that I had wanted to bring up about like the diasporic identity of Jews in relation to settler colonialism in the US and Canada and other places, not to mention obviously the state of Israel. And also I think just like I'm interested in exploring diaspora identity versus like indigeneity and how those things connect, because I think that there's like obvious places of solidarity and we need to be like in solidarity with indigenous movements. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak on that. I think that's important.
I don't know if this is going to answer the question, you know, in terms of like diasporism and indigeneity. No, like it's very, one of the questions we like constantly, you know, like a lot of people hold the idea that like everyone is probably indigenous to somewhere, but this is like much more confusing for us for so many reasons that I probably won't dive deeply into, but there is something very, you know, we see these the migrant caravans coming up, and there is this like deep solidarity with that. It's like, this is what we went through, and to become like a stateless person effectively only opens up like the wider possibilities of like the migratory reality and the maybe like deep lively beauty of like to be able to be migratory, which is like something many people are not afforded the ability. You know, it's like something that the nationalism in the world fights really hard against. You know, there's some fear about the migrant coming in, just like in Europe there was the fear of like the Jew coming from like the deep shtetls and stealing your wife or something. Like these same things have never, like these ideas have never gone away and just transferred from person to person, but it's so much easier to like, you know, resonate that from a stateless perspective and like reject the notion that we even need it anywhere.
But I do think that the recent surge of like, I mean, like mainly queer Yiddish farms that like focus on like land as opposed to the state, and like how stewarding land affects like the decolonial effort. Like, I think they present, well, I mean, I wasn't present in that movement obviously since its inception, but like I think they present like a very emergent, like interesting like intersection that it differs from, I think, the mainstream like Doikite like understanding of like what it really means to be like here. I think in America can actually be much more abstract than maybe like it was for our like Jewish ancestors, and like it is for people who like actively steward land. And so I don't know if other people who have more experience like with like the sort of farming efforts like want to speak more to that, but I think that presents like a really like great intersection of like how like Jews can not only like make a stake in the place that we are, in the host countries that we are, without just being like consistently displaced, but also do it in a way that doesn't displace other people or like serves a sort of communal land effort.
I wish there were people from Asheville here who are Jewish farmers that were in this panel right now, because there's at least one Jewish farming project in Asheville that is a friend of mine is one of the farmers there, and they are really clear that like about being visitors and living the tradition, and also following the calendar cycle and discussing the idea of when you reach the Jubilee, returning the land to the local, the Eastern Band of Cherokee, that they own their land in a really kind of unique way, and they continue to purchase more land, and you can return your land to them by choice here. So I think that those are conversations that are active. And I think it's also really interesting. I believe it was Rosa Daniel Lang-Levitsky who wrote in the book, and I'm really sorry if I'm getting it wrong which author it was, wrote about how it's obvious that Jewish people are from wherever they're from, like ethnically, because you see that Jews from different ethnic regions of the world look similar to the people from that region, that actually the religious, like the mythos of the religion is that everybody is descended from one place, and that's true. And also that primarily Judaism has spread and grown through intermarriage and conversion, which was super interesting because I'd never seen someone write it so clearly and so obviously. And it really, that like, I think it's a really interesting topic for Jews of whatever ethnicity, pretty much nearly almost all of whom, although not all, because there are some indigenous American Jewish people, but almost everyone is a settler here on this land that all of us are on in the American South that where we're speaking, but that everybody actually is from a place, but that place is almost always a place where you're also not welcome. And so really looking at what does it mean to have a connection to a fraught place when there's a dominant narrative that presents like an easy answer of this really modern, like just in the last couple of decades, presentation of Zionism as like Jewish indigeneity to like Eretz Yisrael or like the Middle East or Palestine, like that all Jews are indigenous to that place, which is, there's like this difference of like the spiritual homelandness, which goes beyond and away from Zionism, but that's really not the same thing as being indigenous to that place.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, are you done? I didn't mean to.
Also, my friend SJ put in the Q&A box that they are here, queer Jewish farmer at Yesod Farm and Kitchen.
Yay.
Hi.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, one thing I appreciate, I think why, like, I feel really, yeah, like Jewish anarchism makes so much sense to me in a way is because both Jews and anarchists tend to hold a lot of the tensions and complexities of questions clear. And it's the interplay of the complexity that we find more of the, you know, the truth toward liberation and freedom, not in trying to come up with like, you know, binary understandings of it. So I just think there's a lot in, I guess in the anthology for me also, there are pieces, but also in my own thinking about it is the more we go back and understand traditions, like there's a tradition of how Jews approach, there's many traditions of how Jews approach land and growing. So one tradition is every 7 years, you're supposed to take a whole year off from growing food on land because we don't own the land and the land needs to regenerate, right? And we're stewards, we need sustenance, but we don't own it. So long traditions of commons and gleaning and mutual aid. in, you know, in stories that go back thousands of years and traditions and practices. So going back and looking at, like, we've struggled through all sorts of moments of being colonized and kicked out of places too, and having to go places we don't want to go. And how have we done that well? And how have we done that badly? What can we learn from that? I think Jews have a lot to say about that, actually. And I think a lot of them have been, a lot of us, again, because of this sort of tension between, can we be visible or are we invisible? Or a lot of, I don't know, I don't come through a politics of guilt, but I think a lot of, you know, people who are Jewish kind of have this guilt, like, who am I to speak about my experience? I've been so assimilated. And I'm like, fuck it, I don't want to assimilate. That's not the goal. I shouldn't be asked to do that. Instead, I should say, here's what I understand we can bring to the conversations, right? And so I really like thinking about, I think I'm gonna maybe get the term wrong, but I heard someone speak recently about, you know, other categories of settlers, like, you know, people that are forced to go places because they're you know, they were enslaved, or they had to leave because of genocides, or all sorts, or they don't have any states, protection by states, as flawed as that is, right? And had to go across borders. Is what does it mean to be a settler that's a refugee or forced to be a settler, right? And let's look and understand what that looks like versus those that intentionally tried to colonize and conquer lands, right? Those are distinct types of settlers, right? So how do we relate to that? Seems like an interesting question to me. How do we relate to stereotypes of Jews have been called outside agitators for, I don't know, about 150 years or so, because we've never fit in the body politic. And so how do we understand, you know, even now, when there's this category of outside agitator, it often includes, in the place called the United States, both Blacks and Jews, right? And how can we be proudly agitating when we need to be, and be outside the things we need to be, but be cognizant of that we're, you know, also have to be in solidarity with other people who've had their land stolen and shouldn't have had to have their land stolen. And I guess the last thing I want to say, I talk about this in the book, and it just was so pivotal for me here, learning about this with other people who come from other compulsory diasporic traditions, other people who've been kicked off repeatedly of places that they understand they want to be, through a bunch of other experiences. And a bunch of us started talking about, really, I don't know, I write a little bit about it in the book, about the time of Columbus and 1492 and that era of over 500 years ago, when simultaneously there were vast witch trials and hunts across Europe. And that was against queers and healers and female bodies. And also I learned recently that there was a lot of anti-Semitic tropes that equated witches with Jews, because witches were seen as not Christian. And so, yeah, and they were being burned and killed. And at the same time, you know, the slave trade was gearing up and displacing Black people from where they wanted to be to other lands. And at the same time, you know, Columbus was about to set sail, and other people, to go colonize and displace indigenous people, right? And at the same time, there was the Inquisition, which was targeted at Muslim and Jews and people who were seen as too dark-skinned, and were told to either assimilate or, you know, be killed, or were kicked into diaspora again, right? And there's this really touching story that I heard around that on the day Columbus was supposed to start off on his journey, he had to delay by a day, because that was the final day of when Jews were either being forced to be expelled, go into hiding, or be killed. And there were so many Jews trying to escape that the harbor was too full for Columbus to leave. And so I just like to go back to those moments and say, you know, our pain and our trauma and our resistance and our playbooks to survive that, they have a lot of more common roots than I think we understand. I don't know, it moves me to be like, I think we're going to have better answers to how do we think about what reparations look like, and land back looks like, and unsettling colonialism, and unsettling cops, and unsettling capitalism, than a lot of other traditions, if we, you know, including from our own tradition.
Yeah, I wanted to just throw something in that's very specific to the area of Western North Carolina where Scott and I are living, because whiteness, for a lot of the times that Jews who are now white were settling this land, they were not included in whiteness, our ancestors. And now it wasn't, people were welcomed into whiteness as whiteness did an expansion to consolidate power, which there are like a lot of groups that are sometimes white and sometimes not white, depending on the period of history. And Jew, like white European Jews are one of those groups. And so we saw in the last 50 plus years this expansion of whiteness to include Jews, and many white Jews really welcomed that and were okay with it. But it wasn't actually a choice to become white, and there isn't a choice to unbecome white, that you can betray whiteness, but you can't leave whiteness. And I think that the history of Ashkenazi Jews in the Asheville area is a really interesting story about that, because Ashkenazim came to Asheville and as an entire community who had all moved together, and they all got on a train. Wow. And this is one of the synagogues that still exists, that is the one that I participate in when there's, not a pandemic. They founded this, they came here because they all had family members who had tuberculosis, and there's a lot of tuberculosis treatment here, and they founded a community called Congregation Bikor Cholim, the Visitation of the Sick. But they really had a different relationship with the Chelagi, the Cherokee here, than the other white settlers, and they had a really much more equal trade relationship. And actually the word in Chelagi for Jew is egg eater, because they had a friendly relationship, and Jewish people would visit the Chelagi communities, but they would only eat their eggs because their meat wasn't kosher because it was hunted. And so the word to this day for Jewish person is egg eater. And I think it's just really interesting to look at historically how there was this close relationship between the two communities, and then the history of abandonment of solidarity, that you can't avoid being absorbed into whiteness, but there was an abandonment of solidarity with those neighbors, and that relationship, it does not exist now. And what does it mean to be a settler and a Jew? I think that there are probably a lot more instances of there are choices that individuals and communities can make to reorient what they value and to change what solidarity and who they're connecting with and building community with.
I think also something just that hasn't been said yet on this is that the Nazis did a really, really good job of instilling a eugenicist framework of what it means to be Jewish in, I think, people who descend from Holocaust survivors' heads. And that, or the pogroms, to a similar degree, right? This is just the idea of it is, especially people who did not grow up in a religious circumstance and who were very alienated from that history, have very much so internalized I am Jewish because I'm forced to be Jewish, and therefore I need to be proud of being Jewish because I have no choice but to be Jewish, which is a not totally wrong train of thought on the one hand, but it's also I think creates a lot of roadblocks to actually embracing Judaism by expression, which obviously runs into a lot of issues with converts. It runs into a lot of issues with people who don't practice the type of Judaism, or if you're a secular Jew, I guess it runs into there's a whole obviously host of problems that arise when you just are abstractly Jewish by force. And I think that this is something that I've seen change in a lot of people who held that position that I know personally, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that suddenly as tradition and practice is coming back onto the visible stage for people who have been alienated from their Judaism, or whose grandparents actively decided to reject Yiddish or to reject Judaism entirely or whatever, the ability to have all these learning resources, whether it be Sfara or My Jewish Learning or whatever, to or in quarantine, to suddenly have a bunch of groups who are willing to pop up on Zoom and talk about Jewish expression, has recreated this notion of Judaism as a complex network of expression. And I think that leads into an increased level or potential for solidarity with other peoples who view their peoplehood as not being genetic. And I think that that has a lot of overlap with discourses in indigeneity, and what it means to be indigenous. And I think that is also a and I hope the wording there didn't seem to imply at all that like indigeneity then like can enter the realm of what it means to be Jewish, but like rather that like the like idea of we belonging to a people and what that means to belong to a people has a lot of like cross section and sort of like structure and form. And I think that is like going to be a very exciting like discourse that is now entering into sort of mainstream Judaism, like over the next like, I think like we're entering into sort of the beginning of this thing that like hopefully will like broaden the horizon of like, I think the average like Jew who was alienated, like being able to interact with both Jews and with other people as a Jew. I don't know if this is losing its coherency, but hopefully it makes sense.
Can I jump on that for a second? Like one thing that I was thinking with everyone speaking is in the sort of consolidation of anti-Semitism in the 19th century that like leads up to the Nazis. And this is also like the consolidation of the nation state as we've sort of inherited it at this point. I think one of the big threats that the Jews posed was this like this internal enemy, right? Like that doesn't belong to the state or the nation. And I think that's actually parallel in a way to the indigenous nations within the U.S. because they don't have allegiance to the United States, right? They were in the 19th century and even today in active war against the state, and that would be a place I think it would be interesting to think about. Like though, like Nechoma talked about the kind of like, you know, the being brought into whiteness, and there's a form of like state allegiance that was bought that way that also came through the creation of the state of Israel post World War II, so that like Jews became not this like stateless group that was like kind of infesting all these different European based nation states, but had their own state and like had their own interests.
And also America's, I was just going to say, also America's intervention in World War II, and then the American story of how America saved the Jews that, you know, a lot of Jewish people really believe.
Right.
Yeah.
So like, I guess like one way that I would like trying to put some of these things together to like try to think through a Jewish solidarity with indigenous movements would to be through this statelessness, right? Like, or to be a group of people that disavow the state or disidentify with the state as the form of the desire, which also I think goes with what you were saying from Fayer about a different understanding of belonging too.
I'd love to hear any of you speak about, maybe it's shifting gears a little bit, but I think it's similar. It's like, what do we get? What are we bringing in? Yeah, to say, okay, we want to be out there in terms of like offering forms of liberation and solidarity and doing that as people who are, you know, against states, et cetera. But what we're for, do you have examples of like weaving in sort of, liberatory practices, both in the way we resist and what we're trying to build?
Before folks answer that, I also want to point out that amazingly, we are reaching the end of a 90-minute conversation block. And I think it's okay to go a little bit further, but I know that there's also a desire for some closing remarks. And gosh, yeah, it just feels like this could be like part one of so many discussions that we could have. And I also want to apologize to all the people who typed out really wonderful questions that we're just not going to get to tonight. There's just so much content here that is worth covering. And I hope that this is just a seed for so many more conversations.
Do we want to shift to just everyone saying a few words about sort of, I guess I was trying to get at like, what are you speaking from your own heart? What practices or politics that you've been engaging in as a Jewish anarchist or queer Jewish anarchist that you feel, feel powerful or proud of, or feel are contributing to this bigger project of freedom?
I think we live in a world and also a nation that demands a level of sorrow in regards to work and life. And, you know, probably everyone's had a boss tell them that they weren't working if they were laughing, is kind of, you know, so we live in this world that demands sorrow in a lot of ways. And anytime we find ourselves to be joyous and celebratory, and to be able to look around and see that you and everyone around you is alive, and that you're sharing these lives in this world. And when you look at the past summer and what maybe the next summer, who knows, of the sparks and flames of like, not just rebellion, but like Hashem is what it is. It is Jewish to be against everything America and capital tries to impose on us. It is Jewish to reject work and to reject this world that tries to be imposed upon us. And I think that is, to be able to live that way is a very liberatory practice.
Yeah, I think like just while we're unmuted, adding on to the end of that, that like, yeah, consolidating that, I think that it's important to like sort of what I said before, right? Like being Jewish unhinged rather than being Jewish like with the block of saying like, if I'm too Jewish, then I will elicit this reaction, is like one of the fiercest and like most cross-denominational ways I can see like Judaism having this like revolutionary spirit. And like, I think liberatory, it gets a little bit more murky depending on like exactly like the context you're talking about. But I think that like, especially like for analyzing points of solidarity where you like might not have everyone aligned on exactly why they're there, but who are all there to crush what ultimately is like
the police
or like a prison state, right? Like that comes out of like really the just like ABC of like, I want to live my life according to Torah. Here's how I think I need to do that. Here's how the state like stops that. Therefore, fuck the state. And like, I think that dialogue emerges very naturally in many different types of like sort of Jewish dialects across both the political and denominational spectrum.
Are we going around chat? I can.
Yeah.
Well, I just like a couple quick things, like Cindy, in your one time you define anarchism was like an ethical compass, and for me, like that has always gelled with my understanding my Jewishness too, and so like just like, and also kind of like abolitionism, like and then as an everyday practice of just like what is right, and I know that, right, and I can take that side and always do that. But as a larger communal thing, like I don't feel, this was sort of what I was saying in the beginning, but like I don't feel seen if I'm not seen as Jewish. I don't feel seen if I'm not seen as an anarchist. I don't feel seen if I'm not seen as queer. And to have people who can see me as all three is like very special. And we have this like beautiful little group that's been growing especially over the pandemic for some reason, of queer anarchist Jews locally. And I've been so sad to like not be able to show up to ritual spaces and share meals. But that thirst for that has shown me how important that is to me, and something that I've had this huge hiatus from in my life. And so I'm just looking to do that as a place, like as a community building place, to have the kind of solidarity that we can bring into other forms of struggle, but also that sort of like strength that you have of being with the people who see you and know you and understand you. And so I'm just like, that's where I'm interested right now in putting some of my heart.
Yeah. What am I for as a Jewish anarchist? For me, like being religious is a huge part of my identity. And I feel like there's so much there that I really liked what someone from Fair said, that it was like a capitulation that makes sense when you look at the historical reality, to like say that, okay, that's in our tradition, but that we're just going to capitulate on that part. But that what am I for is really like a messianism of like the Jewish teaching that like we bring the world that we want, a world without oppression, and it's through our actions and the things that we do, like every single day, the like small things and the big things, and like speaking up when there's injustice, and things that like are obviously linked and things that are maybe not so obviously linked, like really taking responsibility for that. It's going to take every single person to make the change that we want to see. And also really leaning into the teaching in Judaism and the like anthropology, sociology, cultural side, that like most Judaisms are really communalist over individualist, that they really come from a place of like the importance of the community and helping other people, coming ahead of this like individualism that's so disgustingly rampant in our society. And so really leaning into like the teachings, the practices, and the like mitzvahs that have to do with taking care of other people, and like how much are you participating in what is essentially like a religious and cultural framework of mutual aid. And I would say that I'm also just leaning into like, I don't have any answers, but what I've been really thinking about recently is this Hasidic teaching of Hashgacha Pratis, which is like minute divine intervention in your life, that like everything that's happening does have a reason, even if you can't see it, and really trying to lean into like, what does it mean that there's a possibility that I believe, that I get that a lot of people on this call are not going to believe, that like everything that's happening in the world, somehow there's a reason for it, even though like we see that it's wrong and we oppose it, and like what does it mean to be in that world? And so I don't have any answers about that, but that is what I've been thinking about a lot lately. What does it mean that the horrible things that are happening not by accident? And like, how can that be a catalyst? And God forbid, like I don't want to say a good thing, but like, how can that lead to something good for all of us? Also, I just wanted to throw out there the right now we're in a period of time that the traditional kind of teaching would be to study Pirkei Avos from the Talmud between Passover and Shavuos, and that there's this just awesome line in there. I pulled it up on one of these, I don't know where it went, but it basically says that you should never grow too close to the government because they are only nice to you for their own interests. It's like Pirkei Avos is the teachings of our fathers, and it's just like a whole bunch of like sayings. And I just love that one. It's like, never get too close to the government. They'll only be nice to you for their own benefit, and they'll like stab you in the back, basically. It's like in like chapter 1, book 1, right at the beginning.
Thank you for bringing that in so much.
I just wanted to put that out there because when I read that the first time, I was like,
yeah, I really appreciate you all answering that question. I just think like this is a lot of what we're doing right now, is like bringing out little stories and tidbits like that among us that feel really powerful, but then bringing them out into the street to actions, direct actions, demonstrations, to moments of grief. And there's so much richness of, I've been lately just, it's really struck by disproportionate numbers of Jews have been part of every radical and revolutionary social movement of the past 100 and 150 years. And you go, why? For instance, like Our Bodies, Ourselves, like the collective that wrote that book, whatever that was in the 70s, like something like 80% of them, 85% of them were Jews. But yet they were really disconnected from their Judaism. So they just thought it was incidental. But then I went to a teaching recently about all the levels of consent that are in Jewish writings that have been like that are really prominent. And you can find lots of different understandings about how you should relate to your own body and consent to things done to it, etc. You know, so I don't know, I just really love the power in what we can do by bringing our traditions and our languages and our cultures and our legacies and our playbooks for having gotten through a lot of shit. And it's so beautiful like that. So I really appreciate you all bringing in the beauty of that, because I think it enriches. Yeah, I think as an anarchist, I always say this, like, I really want people to be anarchists for life. And I think it's really hard to be an anarchist if you don't have anything else to hold up your anarchism. And Judaism, like, actually has a framework for sustaining community over thousands of years outside of states, and anarchism doesn't. You know, and that's, I guess, to me, the beautiful power right now of, like, us as Jewish anarchists saying, hey, it's possible not to have to do that, you know, and it's joyous and it's beautiful and it's healing and it's wonderful. We eat a lot, we sing a lot, we joke a lot, we argue a lot. So I really appreciate you all. And I'll just end on this, and then I know Liberty's going to kind of wrap it up. I really hate doing these events online. It's breaking my heart, which is already so broken so many times over. I really want, if the anthology is for anything, just get it, read it with other people, sit around as much as you can outside. I want to try to come around to different places outside. It's meant to just be a provocation for us to have lots and lots more conversations and not feel like we can't do that as Jewish anarchists. And so I really want to encourage, if anyone wants to have further conversations, I want to, I'm sure most other people on this call want to. So we should keep talking to each other, like, reach out, let's make more spaces, right? We're good at that. Let's set up another Mishkan, other places, and have deeper, richer conversations, and, you know, go really farther into this than we have tonight. So get in touch with me or anyone on this afterward and talk to each other.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. This was sort of a little bit of a record-breaking turnout for our bookstore. And I think that speaks to the moment we're in and the need for these types of spaces. So if you've enjoyed tonight and you didn't already pick up a copy of the book, I would invite you to grab one. It's a great opportunity to support AK Press, who published it. Oh my gosh, wow, this is great. Yeah, we're just all gonna flash our books. Oh no, we didn't plan this. This is spontaneous. We do have plenty of copies still at Firestorm and offer $1 shipping if you're calling in from outside of Asheville. And we're gonna take us out with one more song for the evening. So this was beautiful. Thank you to everyone.
Stay for the song.
Thank you, Firestorm.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
It must have always been this way, 'cause when I look back, there's never any before. And yeah, I've always had this heaviness that makes me wonder if I can keep on willing to call away. If there's anything else out there anyway. Don't you know there's nothing more than a broken heart. I get by on my faith and I don't know any other way. But it isn't joyful, just survival. The voice said it'll be okay. Only love can turn this grief around, and there's no one here now. Don't you know there's nothing more than a broken heart. Because I don't believe in innocence, but I know how much we've lost. Somehow we know we're not too far gone. There's nothing wrong with us. Don't you know there's nothing more than a broken heart. There's nothing more than a broken heart. All the times that I have tried so hard, put everything on the line. My failures collect so much regret, seems to be a sign. But we still have something left to give, to live the life, try to love again. Don't you know there's nothing more than a broken heart. Because I don't believe broken heart. No.